you bad. You know I'm hurting. The truth is bad, but lying's worse. I know I don't want that. I'm always learning. Maybe it's sad. Our love is cursed. I know I'm all up, but truth is on the way. I'm falling. I start every day. I want you to resuscitate. Be honest. Even if it's fake, I want it. Give it to me heart to heart. It's ready. It was cloudy from the sun. I need it, even if it tears us apart, apart. I want it. Give it to me heart to heart. Let's talk it out. Just give it to me straight. No, I won't change. Want to feel it in my brain. You're like the sun. You stare me in the face. Can't look away. I'm blinded by your name.
Barry, really good musical choice. Thank you for playing us in. Welcome everybody to the RVAT live stream, Republican Voters Against Trump. We only have 2 more live streams before the election. There's a very special Saturday one happening with me, Miles Taylor, and Luke Skywalker himself. Mark Hamill is joining us on Saturday, so I hope you guys can too. But today, I'm really excited because we have one of my personal heroes on the live stream, and I know that Bill Kristol thinks it's him, but it is actually former Governor Todd Whitman, who I've admired for a long time. And I want to kind of kick us off by saying, look, you were the first female governor of New Jersey. You ran the APA for a while under Bush. But by way of introduction, what don't we know about you that you've done? Tell me something in your bio we wouldn't know on the top lines.
Probably that I live on a farm and have done a lot of farming. And actually, I figured out that it prepared me well for being in government because I had to clean a lot of horses' stalls. And that means there was a lot of manure that I had to deal with. So I got some good practice.
Yeah. Governor Whitman will not remember this, but the first time we met, I think was when I was Vice President Quayle's chief of staff in 1990, and you ran for the Senate. I got the years right, I think, against Bill Bradley.
No, that's correct.
And you ran an excellent race. And we did, I don't think that Quayle was that popular in New Jersey, probably. So we didn't, I think we did a fundraiser maybe, though.
No, he came.
Did we come? I can't remember.
We did an event in the mall in Morristown, and it was the first time that he'd been booed. Coming because he was supporting me and I'm pro-choice, and he was booed. He was a little bit discomfited by that.
Yeah, okay, so I couldn't quite remember, but I remember we met, and everyone remembers you as a very successful governor, winning twice in a very tough state. But I remember that race against Bradley, who was considered untouchable, had been senator for 12 years, and genuinely impressive guy, I think we could say. And you came, and 1990 was not a great year for Republicans, and you came within a couple of points, right?
Couple of points, yes. And he vastly outspent me. He had about 12 million and I had less than $1 million.
Yeah.
He was a hero here too, because he'd been a Knicks basketball player, Princeton graduate,
right.
Oxford fellow, scholar, a bright guy, very able guy.
Did you end up on good terms with him afterwards?
Oh yes. We really didn't differ all that much. His mistake was that he had spent, I think, so much time in Washington that he had forgotten about New Jersey, and we were in the throes of massive tax increases on everything, including toilet paper. And I kept asking him what he felt about New Jersey taxes, which has nothing to do with the United States Senate. He had nothing to do with it. And every day I'd wake up waiting for him to say, I hate taxes as much as the next person, but I've got to respect the governor and what he has to do with this. And he just would never do that. And then at the end of the day, the very last ad he ran, or he didn't really, it was the only ad basically that he ran, except the I guess the really anti ones against me were for the gubernatorial. But he was in Washington, behind his desk in Washington, and he was talking about some really esoteric thing. And he kicks back at the end and puts his feet on the desk with his basketball sneakers on. And you had people, we had lost 350,000 jobs at that point. And we were hurting. We were a hurting state, and people were furious. And I think that's what got me that as close as it did.
Wow.
Enough reminiscing about the times before Sarah was born, but it was
Right, exactly.
Have fond memories of this,
Well, no, it is actually, it's interesting in part because, I think that as I sort of came up and was interested in the Republican Party, I always had my eye on kind of these moderate Republican governors that I really felt like were the people that I could identify with from a policy and a temperament standpoint. And you really fit that mold. And one of the things as we kind of move into this discussion, both about Trump and then post-Trump for the Republican Party, I think the question is I really thought that the Kasich, Hogan, Christie and Todd Whitman sort of model for the Republican Party, like that was the future. And that was what I was kind of hanging in for. Why do you think that's not how it went? Why do you think it seems to, or unless you disagree with the premise, but why do you think it's ended up in a different direction?
Well, I think it ended up in a different direction because everybody got so scared of the far right so early on. I mean, it was really surprising to see, because I kept maintaining with many of these races, look, if you just stand up and say, this is who I am, and this is how I approach issues, and I'm not always going to agree with you, you're not always going to agree with me, but you'll know I'm doing what I think is in the best interest, and not worry so much about the hard line on the right or the left. And I think the American people, I've always believed the American people are more in the center, and certainly amongst Republicans, and that they'd be there for these candidates. But, they just got terrified of the far right. And we as Americans, we will fight to the death for our rights in a democracy, but we forget about our responsibilities. And we weren't voting. I mean, primary voter turnouts were 12% back in those days. And that meant it was the most partisan people choosing the candidates for the fall, where you'd get people who say a pox on both your houses, I don't like either candidate. So you'd get a 34% turnout for congressional elections when they were the top of the ticket, and barely break 51 or 52% on presidentials. And over time, that just got worse and worse and worse.
But do you think that actually, so I think that's right about sort of capitulating to the far right, but it also seems like I thought after 2016 that clearly I was missing something, because I couldn't believe that there were enough people in the Republican Party who wanted to see Donald Trump as the standard bearer. And obviously 2016 was a little bit of a weird deal because there were so many Republicans in the race that they were kind of fracturing the regular Republican vote, and Trump kind of got to be over by himself in his burn it all down lane and win it with a plurality of like 30%. But still, that recessive gene that was kind of like the Sarah Palin, Pat Buchanan strain that's always been there, it now seems to be the dominant gene. And now I push back when people say that, and I say, look, that's not everybody in the Republican Party, but it just does seem to be more of the Republican Party, that more people were interested in kind of burning things down and even just in like hating Democrats more than they're affirmatively for anything. Mm-hmm. And so do you think it's more?
There are two parts to that, Sarah, what you're saying, really, because first of all, yes, Republicans today, when you poll, are overwhelmingly pro-Trump, but that is an ever-shrinking part of the pie. I mean, for the first time now, registered independents outnumber registered Republicans. We're losing that base. We're losing people, because what happened in 2016, I believe, was because of the divisions we'd seen in Congress. Congress was not responding to what the people wanted. They weren't focusing on the major issues. They weren't trying to work across the aisle to get major things done in a bipartisan way. And the public was feeling, hey, you're not listening to me. You're not hearing me. I don't think the world's going to be a better place for my kids than I found it. We will be the first generation to say that. And so they just wanted someone who was going to throw everything upside down, which they certainly got, I think, to a degree that none of them anticipated or really wanted. But there are two things there. It's when you talk about the Republican base today, that's a much smaller group of people, so it's easier to get to the higher numbers. But overall, it's something that, I mean, yes, we've seen it coming over time. My book, for Pete's sakes, I wrote that in 2005, where I worried about this trend of conceding so much and moving more and more to the right, because that that puts you in a place where you're not able to connect with so many of the American voters and Republicans. I mean, it used to be, my father always described the parties as like umbrellas, because you had a central handle that reflected the basic shared values that you had. But then you had all the ribs that held up the canopy, and those ribs were different ways of interpreting it, so that you could have a moderate, a conservative, or a liberal within underneath that umbrella, and they could still hold to those central principles. And that's what we've lost.
I have never heard that analogy. I love that analogy.
It fit better than a tent to my mind, because it was that one central.
That's awesome. Well, I want to put this question to both of you. And I'm really interested in your answers. It's the tough question though. I'll start with Bill. Do you think that the Republican Party is salvageable?
I mean, I don't know, because history is very unpredictable, and it really depends, I think, on a lot of different things. Assuming Trump loses, how Biden governs, what Republicans in Congress do, what issues come to the forefront. But I think could be salvageable. I've gotten more pessimistic, I've got to say. I hope there's a real rethinking, but you don't see much of it yet. But I was talking with our friend Mike Murphy, who's doing a lot of work with us in Florida to try to make sure that state comes through for Biden. And I think Mike worked for Governor Whitman way back when, and New Jersey, when we still won states like New Jersey, I might add, and at the governorship level, and George H.W. Bush, if I'm not mistaken, won it in '88. But and to get a party back that could do that would be nice. And he was saying, well, a big defeat could really wake people up. He was saying to me more than I think. I was being pessimistic. He was being a little more hopeful. So, but you should answer this. And I want to ask you, because it hadn't really occurred to me until we were talking, you must know Joe Biden reasonably well. I mean, just all these years in politics, and it's a neighboring state. So give us a little, I mean, we don't, give our viewers more of a sense of what he's just like and what in your dealings with him.
Well, I can't claim a close personal relationship, but certainly we ran into one another and interacted from time to time. And, he's a decent man. He's an honest man, and he's strong. And he has always shown not only a willingness, but an ability to reach out and work across the aisle to get things done, because that's been his commitment. That's why he runs for office, not because of a title or a perceived power, but he wanted to get things done. There were certain things he wanted to accomplish. And you saw that reflected in the way he approached his responsibilities in the Senate. I'm a little more on the Mike Murphy side than you, because I do think it depends on who wins and by what plurality. I mean, if Trump wins, then that's it. I mean, the label Republican rests with him, but it will become a marginalized faction. And in 4 years, I think the Democrats are going to run the table. If Trump wins. If Biden wins by a small percentage point, then I think it's going to be a fight within the Republican Party as to who's going to come out on top, whether it's going to be that Trump-like supporters or the more centrists. And if Biden has a big win, we'll have 4 years of a stable government, and without all this craziness up and down. That will give Republicans a time to regroup, a chance to regroup. It will be a repudiation of the Trump group, and they will be marginalized in that case. And it will give an opportunity for Republicans to really decide, do we want to be the other party? Because I believe this country operates much the best with a two-party system. Multi-party just doesn't work, I don't think, with all our levels of government.
Did you deal with, I'm just curious now that I'm just thinking as we're having this conversation, did you deal with Trump much in the 90s when you were governor? He did stuff in New Jersey, right? Or was that later?
Yes, he had casinos. I definitely dealt with him. And that was why early on I said, this is not a man that has the moral authority, the intelligence, the intellect, the interest in being to qualify him for president. So I was a never Trumper from the beginning, because I saw the way he treated people in Atlantic City with his casinos. And it was what really bothered me. It was things like, it was the small guy. It was the electrician or the plumber working in his casinos, that when it came time to pay the bill, he said, well, I'm going to give you X amount on the dollar, pennies on the dollar, and go sue me. Well, these weren't people who could sue him. They didn't have the wherewithal to do that. And that's been his history. And that just tells you the kind of person that he is. So I never felt he had the character to be president of the United States and represent us with any kind of dignity.
The answer you just gave about it depends on by how much, and the Republican Party can go back and reconstitute itself. I give almost a verbatim answer, just like that. That's my answer to that question too. So it's a very good answer.
Good. I'm glad you like it.
Yes, it's a terrific answer. But I guess my question, and the question I get pushback on, that I think is fair, is I think now we have to ask ourselves for real, is some of the issue though that like whoever comes after Trump, right? There's two problems for them. One is that Trump probably doesn't go away in a way that like a previous president might have, right? He continues to tweet, and I would posit that Donald Trump, it has always mattered more to him to own the Republican Party than it has been to defeat the Democrats. And so we're still going to have to contend with Donald Trump, and candidates are still going to want his endorsement, and whoever comes after him, like you could see a 2024 situation where you've got sort of your Nikki Haley, Tim Scott, people trying to figure out how to fuse that Trumpy coalition together with the more establishment coalition and move the party forward. And then you've got Tucker Carlson or Tom Cotton or Josh Hawley over on the other side trying to see if they can do the nationalist populist thing a little bit better. And it's also a question of the voters, right? Like what does the base of the Republican Party want? Like we still have partisan primaries. So I think the question is like, how do you shake Trump off? I agree with you. We need to have a center-right party in this country. It's deeply important. But can we have one that's responsible in the future?
Well, see, I would disagree. And I know I'm an outlier on this and I could be totally wrong. But first of all, I don't think Trump gives a rat's posterior about the Republican Party. All he wants is a vehicle, and all he wanted was a vehicle to power. But he's going to have real legal problems when he leaves office. He can self-pardon at the federal level, but he can't do anything about New York. And unless they allow him full tweeting abilities in the state prison, it might just make it a little more difficult for him. But seriously, I think he's going to have to contend with a lot of issues that he's not going to like, and that'll mute his voice. I don't know. Bill, what do you think?
No, again, I had this long conversation this morning with Mike Murphy, also my friend Bob Kagan, who's a foreign policy scholar, and you know him well also, but trying to think about the implications of what might happen. And he made the other point, which is, look, even if Biden doesn't pursue a particularly vengeful set of investigations, or the Democrats in Congress don't, and they probably shouldn't, and overdo that, they move forward and all, still they'll have obligations to look into certain things, and certain documents will come to light, and certain transactions and other things, and not just of Trump, but of his whole people around him and whole top tier. And so I agree with you, this is extending your point. I mean, the world will look very different in 2022 if, to take one extreme, Trump's running a very successful TV network, and there are Trumpists all over the place, and there's no real, and maybe the economy's gotten a little worse just because, the world is unpredictable, and everyone looks back and Trump doesn't look so terrible in a funny way. Or Trump is really under criminal indictment, and a lot of Trumpists, other people close to him are, and people have turned over the rocks and discovered all kinds of other things that happened that we don't yet know about. And so forth. So, I mean, it's very hard to know kind of what, if you just try to jump ahead 2 or 3 years, what the Trump legacy at that point looks like. But it could look pretty unpleasant. And in that case, I do think maybe there's a little more of a, oh my God, we need a fresh start, which would be helpful.
Yeah. As an OG never Trumper, as you said, both of you are, and Bill and I talk about this a lot. I think that there's Trump and the problems that Trump presents. But then there's basically everything we've seen over the last 4 years. When Donald Trump won, I was getting all these texts and calls from my friends because I'm the only Republican they know. And I was telling them, guys, it's going to be okay. Like, Republicans are serious, responsible people. Our institutions are strong in America. Like, he will be constrained. And I'll tell you, there have been obviously perfectly good. He has stressed our institutions, but many of them have held. But one of the most disappointing is Republicans in Congress. What do we do? So take a Nikki Haley. Let's say that she becomes sort of the new face of the Republican Party, the de facto nominee in 2024. What do you do about the fact that we all watched her over these 4 years when democracy was looking pretty fragile, and she chose to throw in her lot with Trump. Like, how do we evaluate these people as we think about what it means to rebuild the party?
Well, that's going to be the challenge. It really is. I don't think any of these members of the House or the Senate today who have been enablers of this president throughout these 3.5 years can, with any credibility after this election, let's say he loses substantively, stand up and say, well, I never really was with him and I didn't vote for him. That just, their credibility is down the tubes, and they're not going to be factors, I don't think. Nikki Haley, she will point to, there were times when she stood up to him and times when she didn't. And we're not going to get, I'm not saying I think she's the candidate, but we're not going to get anybody, I don't believe, who is a purist on this. It's just, the politics have been so crazy that I don't see that we'll find someone who has been consistently separated themselves from the president if they have been in any kind of appointed or elective position. Now, at the federal level, you have governors out there, some of who have stood up right from the beginning, some Republican governors. But again, when you're facing these kind of crises that you face and you need the federal government behind you, it's pretty darn hard to go after somebody who's as vindictive as Donald Trump is. And he is. He's just, you have to be with him 1,000%. And if you're not, then you're the enemy. And right now, I don't believe there is a Republican Party, because the fact that they didn't even bother to try to adopt a platform tells me that now it's a cult of personality. I mean, they're admitting it. That whatever Donald Trump says we believe, that's what we believe today, even though it may change tomorrow. That's where we are. And that's not a viable party, I don't think.
How old were you when you ran for your first office?
Oh, gosh. First office was a freeholder in Somerset County, and I guess I must have been 28, 29.
Oh, wow.
Is that the kind of thing you do? Like, is that a Republican or a Democrat position, or?
It's an executive position and runs the county. It's like county commissioners anywhere else. Actually, I think they finally changed the name to commissioner. It was a hangover from the British days when you have to own land free and clear to be in the office. So you run the counties, and it's a partisan election.
Oh, it is partisan. So I guess This is why I'm asking is, so let's say you were starting your career over again today. Would you run as a Republican now?
Well, the kind of Republican Party it was then. This was a long time ago. Yes, it still was not the party that you see today. We hadn't had a Tea Party movement then.
But would you run? But would you counsel a 26-year-old who came to see you and said, "I'm interested in getting involved in 2022"? I mean, I'm sure you get these people. I do too. It's a little hard to know what to advise them, honestly, in terms of which party to run in or how to run in if they're going to run in the Republican Party.
No, it is hard. And I do get the same questions that you do. I encourage them to run, though, because we need decent, caring people to run. And I keep reminding them, I really honestly believe, because I've seen it a couple of times in my elections where I've had issues thrown at me at the last minute that were very problematic, depending on how I came down on them. Well, the first time, for instance, when I ran for re-election as a freeholder, we had a mandate from the state to locate a trash dump. I mean, this all sounds very minor, but in a small county. So the powers that be, the other freeholder all men, thought I would be a great one to be the one who chaired that in my re-election year. So I did, but I was very open about how we were going to do it. We had a public hearing that went till 2 a.m. I kept the records open for as long as possible. I told them every step. And by the time we picked the municipality where it was going to be located, I didn't win it by what I'd won it by before, but I won it. And the same thing happened in my gubernatorial. I had an issue that came up, and I think the Republicans controlled the Assembly and the Senate at that point, and they passed a bill that I said I just can't sign. It was unconstitutional. And they didn't think I would really take that position. It was about abortion. And they didn't think I'd take that position in a re-election year, and I did. And it brought a third candidate into that election. It nearly cost me the election, but I still won. And, that's the thing I try to persuade people. You don't have to win by a landslide. All you have to do is win. That's what, if you really care about making a difference and being in a position to do that through an elective office, then you need to win. And you can do that by being honest and by being consistent and saying who you are and how you'll approach issues. And people do respect it. They may not always agree with you, but at least they'll respect you. And that makes it much easier to get their support when it comes to an election.
I guess one advantage, I mean, of a young person, or even not so young, but a new person coming in, or a person coming from this local or state level to the federal level, is, they can slightly bracket all these fights of the last few years. They weren't involved. They didn't defend Trump. They didn't vote to acquit him or whatever in impeachment, against impeaching him, or they didn't vote to authorize various things they shouldn't have. So it does. I very much agree, actually, that the kind of new blood, fresh blood in 2022 and 2021 and 2023 for the states that elect in the off years and so forth, it's very, very important to encourage that. And that probably does also mean people who will emphasize different issues, maybe than the ones that we're used to. You were head of the EPA for a couple of years under President Bush. I mean, where you've been keeping up, I'm sure, on all those issues. What about climate change? Could the Republican Party stand on that? And I'm just curious. I'm sure you've been unhappy with Republicans for a while and on that issue. So could that change?
It's such a shame because the environment is our issue. I mean, the first person to set aside public land was Abraham Lincoln with Yosemite. And we know what Teddy Roosevelt did, but it was Richard Nixon working with the Democrat Congress that established the Environmental Protection Agency and signed the Clean Air Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, the Clean Water Act. I mean, and these have been bipartisan efforts with Republicans very much part of it. It should be our issue.
We signed President Bush, the first President Bush signed, as you know, the 1991 Clean Air Act amendments, which I think history shows, and I it's not an issue I'm at all expert on, and I wasn't at the time involved really, but history shows that's really had a pretty big effect in cleaning up the air from particulate matter.
A huge impact. And, George W. Bush gets hammered on a lot of things, but he did some good stuff with the environment too. There was never this attack on us that you have with this administration. I mean, it's been extraordinary the way the administration has just demonized science, denigrated scientists, refuses to believe them, undermined public confidence in what the scientists say because of what he says. And that's done real damage to our confidence in our institutions just across the board with everything he does. But there is a group, as you know, in Congress that is a bipartisan group that believe in climate change. There are Republicans that do believe, that currently are in office at the federal level, who know that we've got to do something about this issue. That obviously we as humans didn't cause climate change. The climate's been changing since the earth was formed. But our behavior has so stressed this natural phenomena that nature can no longer accommodate it. And it's costing us big time in real dollars and human life. Just look at the storms. We had, by July 8th of this year, just July, we'd had 10 major climate-related weather events, each of which cost us $1 billion in recovery. And that was before you had all the wildfires that you had in the West, California, Washington, Colorado now. It was before you had the major hurricanes. And so this is a serious thing. Plus the fact I think it isn't a national security issue as well, because of the way it destabilizes already countries that are still just trying to get hold of their principles of government. It's a place where Al Qaeda and ISIS go to recruit, and where unfortunately organized crime seems to be thriving in some of these cities that are suddenly inundated with nomadic tribesmen who, because of droughts, can no longer sustain themselves, and they go into the cities where there are no jobs, no housing, and it's exacerbating and destabilizing governments. So we have to care about it on a host of different levels. And that's another thing that I applaud Joe Biden on, for understanding that the Green New Deal as it was proposed initially went a little too far as dates and timing. But the idea of addressing the climate change issue in a holistic way is the right one. And so he hasn't adopted, much to the consternation of many on the left, the whole Green New Deal. He just hasn't, but he has said, look, this is an important issue and we need to get on top of it if we are going to be able to move forward successfully as a country. Sea level rise is real. We're losing homes. People are losing their homes. They're losing their livelihoods. And that's because of what's going on with the climate.
And there are market-friendly ways to address it that are less intrusive and more incentives and taxes, not, massive command and control, right? So.
Well, we've seen that. I mean, between 1984 and 2017, we had a population growth of 24%, an increase in demand for power of 44%. The real GDP went up 65%, and 167%. And we saw the 6 major criteria pollutants, air pollutants, the 6 worst ones, decrease by over 65%.
Wow.
So we had more people using more energy, growing the economy incredibly, and still reducing pollution. So it's not a zero-sum game.
Okay, so I have a what if question for you. So Joe Biden is making noise, much as you point out, consternation of some folks on the left that he may want to incorporate some Republicans into his administration. You've been kind of a Republican for Biden, outspoken. I think you're working directly with the campaign to some degree. That could be you. Would you ever work in a Joe Biden administration?
Well, first of all, it's never going to happen. That's just outside the realm of possibility. But, you'll always serve your country if you think the administration is the right one. I mean, had I been asked by Trump, there's no way. And in fact, I had people who came to me who said, should I join the Trump administration? And I said, right from the beginning, I think you want to be awful careful. I know it means a lot to have federal service on your resume, but you don't want to be tainted if it's not a good administration. So if it's an administration in which you deal, I think you have to take that kind of thing seriously. I don't worry about it because it's not going to happen to me, and I'm not looking for it. So, it's fine. But I think everybody has to.
Do you think it's possible he will put a Republican in his administration?
I think it's very likely. I mean, Joe Biden is someone who believes in the government should reflect the population, the country that he said it over and over again. He's going to represent everybody, not just the people who voted for him. So I don't know, Bill, do you think I'm crazy? But I think he will.
Yeah, I think it's a custom until we forget, even as late as the polarization of the George W. Bush and Obama Biden years, which was pretty polarized. And there still was at least one Republican in the cabinet, so a little bit nominal, or Democrat in each case, a little bit nominal, maybe, in a place that wasn't too controversial and so forth, transportation. But I think Biden is pretty serious about it, and I think he'd be well served. He can have some people from the left wing. I mean, I think he will try to have a big tent or a big umbrella within his administration. And there are some areas where there is more potential for bipartisanship. I may be crazy on this. Here I'm more on the hopeful side. I think if he goes with a big climate bill, and if he tries to consult people like you and economists, who are friendly, who take climate change seriously, but also would prefer to have tax incentives and so forth, rather than a giant regulatory apparatus. And if he incorporates some of that in his legislation, I don't know, could he not get Republican votes for some of this in the House and the Senate? I would hope he could. I can't believe they're just all going to say, no, absolutely not. And I mean, I don't know. On the other hand, the last few years have been so partisan and polarized that maybe not. So I guess I have the same idea in terms of his administration. He should be able to get people in there. In some areas more than others. Some areas, you're sort of one way or the other. But a lot of these areas are continuums. They're not, black and white. And you could imagine trade-offs that a lot of our friends, I think, on the Republican side, a lot of conservative economists I know, a lot of scientists I know who are personally somewhat conservative, would be comfortable with, I think.
I think the biggest obstacle to that is Mitch McConnell in the Senate. He's still the leader. Because he has, I've just been, it's hard to describe. I mean, how he can say to the president, don't sign a relief bill until after the election.
Yeah, I agree with that.
These are people who are losing their jobs, their homes, their livelihoods. They're scared. They're losing their health care. They're dying, sick and dying. And he wants to make this political like that. I think it's just shameful. Of course, I thought what they did with Merrick Garland was also shameful, but that's me.
Well, I agree with everything you've said. And it's fun listening to you talk about this. Do you have any, just maybe to close out, I think just to stay on the theme of what we were talking about, but, assuming that we all agree on this little panel here, that we need a strong center-right party in this country, how are we going to do it? what are we going to do to claw our way back, knowing that there's a lot of voters who've been interested in Trump, but like just as a sort of a parting shot, what does this party need to do? Besides, I understand sort of the wrestling in the wilderness, but there's got to be more, right? I mean, we've watched Jeff Flake and so many of the moderates that I keep getting these horrible text messages from the Trump campaign about 800% matches and whatnot, because I gave money to Will Hurd and Carlos Curbelo still in 2018 because there were still Republicans that I wanted to support. But they're all gone. And I'm worried, even look, I'm not thrilled with Susan Collins and how she's behaved, but she's one of the few. She led on a lot of issues that were really important to me around LGBT rights and repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell and things like that. And so, but if she's gone and most of the other moderates are gone, what are we going to do to rebuild this party? Because you're going to have a real leadership role in that.
Well, it's going to take, I think, those people that have been defeated, particularly the ones that were defeated in primaries by the farther right of them, to come together and start to try to figure out how we do this. It's going to take some big fundraisers, some big supporters. And there are just so many out there. The problem I have is if you look at the landscape now, and it's great that we have all these different groups of Republicans, 43 for Biden, former R&Is for Biden, but they're all out there. They're all different. And then you hope that there won't be turf battles as to which of those groups becomes the lead in trying to rebuild the party, but it's going to be people from those various groups, I believe, that are going to be the ones who have to bring it back together and say, we need a serious discussion. And we all want the same thing, basically, in a center-right party that's viable, that can compete nationally and is open to bringing people together.
And how much forgiveness does there going to have to be in that? Because I'll tell you, one of the things that I struggle with personally, and it's probably just a character deficiency on my part, but is what do you do when you've watched to do that, right? You have to make common cause with a bunch of people that you've watched behave very poorly over the last 4 years. And how do we do that?
Well, you just have to get beyond that. I mean, it's just like you were mentioning Susan Collins. I've given her more money than I usually give candidates in this cycle, and yet I've been very disappointed by a number of her votes in the last few years. But still, she's the kind of person that you can build around, that ultimately wants to do the right thing, and felt the pressure. I don't think any of us who are not serving right now in the Congress can appreciate just how strong between the leadership and the president the retribution is if you don't stay in line, and what it means if you really believe that the only place that you can make the appropriate difference is in that current position, and you're not doing it just for, I have no time for people that do it just for the perceived power or the title, but those who have that conundrum, that age-old conundrum of how much do you concede to the voters, how much do you don't ever compromise your principles, but you can change some positions without doing that. And how much do you do that in order to ensure re-election so you're in a position to make a difference? And how much when do you get to the point where you say, no, that's enough, I've got to step aside? And we have a number of those that have decided before, I can't do this anymore. I'm not going to run in this kind of atmosphere and try to go along with this president. I can't do that. And those are the people I think that we need to look to be rebuilding the party.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. And Sarah, you mentioned Carlos and Curbelo and Will Hurd, both of whom the governor knows well. Carlos, especially, I think maybe for working on some of the climate issues. And one's in Florida, one's in Texas, very important states. They're both young men, and they happen to either lose or choose not to run again. And I know personally a lot of people who thought of running in 2018 or 2020 for Congress or for mid-level state positions and just chose not to. They didn't want to be in the position of supporting Trump. They didn't want to be in the position of running in a primary and being anti-Trump. But they can all run. That I think it really is important, actually, thinking ahead. We cannot let those people just retire, in a sense. We need to go see Carlos Curbelo, and he's, of course, thinking about this. Say, okay, what do you want to run for? Now, once Trump is gone, it will be different. The pressure will be different. The primaries, I don't know how successful it'll be in a primary against a Trumpy person in Florida, against Matt Gaetz or something. But that's a fight worth having. And same with Hurd in Texas and many others. So I do think, I'm slightly moving over maybe to the view that maybe the removal of just a new moment, if Trump's out of office, really could change the dynamics in the party in 2022 and beyond.
Well, with those optimistic last words from the two of you, I will not cloud this with my darkness. Governor Kristine Todd Whitman, thanks so much for coming on and talking to us today. I really appreciate it. It was wonderful to hear from you. Bill, as always,
great to see you.
Our fearless leader. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. Reminder, Mark Hamill, 7 o'clock on Saturday. Join us. And then after that, we'll see you next week for our last one right before the election.